Welcome back to the Rakk Factor podcast, and today we're going to be talking everything fall food plots. I'm Zach Haas with Creek Bottom Land Management. Alongside me is Tom and Tim with Rakk Fuel. So obviously we're getting to the time of year where we have to really start putting the afterburners on here and getting these food plots in. And really what you're probably asking yourself is, what should we be planting? When should we be planting? Why should we be planting it? Or maybe right now, since we're dealing with drought, how do we fix maybe a failed spring plot? Or how do we fix maybe later in the year if we keep having this drought? What can we do to prevent having a failure and having success for this fall? So we have a lot of different varieties to go over today and a lot of premium food plot seeds that you guys can select. So we're going to be looking into design strategies. Where should we plant it? What can be planted together? How can you maybe take an existing field and amplify it for this fall? So for instance, like a soybean field that maybe you have, how can we sweeten it up a little bit so the deer definitely want to use it? And now also going into, maybe you did put in some rack magnet this spring. How do you transition that into a fall blend? So with that said, we're going to kind of dive into it. So when we look at fall food plots, what are fall food plots? Well, when I think of fall food plots, I'm thinking about my grains. I'm thinking about my leafy plants like brassica species, your purple top turnips, your radish, collards, you name it, stuff that's really big, robust, something that deer can get the best bang for what they're eating. Plus, we want to think, what are we hunting? Are we a big bow hunter, early season, rut? Are we thinking rifle? Are we thinking muzzleloader, shotgun, whatever it might be? How can we prolong it? You could be like some of my clients where all they're thinking about is shed hunting. Well, how do we plant something so the deer have enough food available for that January, February shed hunting fun season with the kids and stuff like that, picking up antlers? So when I dive into it, I start thinking, okay, how can I have variety? Variety is key to success. If you're just the guy that goes in every year just planting one type of turnip and you're just liking just pure brassica and that's it, nonstop, year after year, but you're not having different success, we want to talk about variety. And that's what all of our blends are built on, is variety. Stuff that is drought tolerant, stuff that can handle some wet ground, maybe something that can be a little bit in more nutrient poor soil, something that make sure will grow for you. Now, it all varies depending on if you're sand country, if you're in more of kind of a mucky, wet area, if you're into more your topsoil area, like let's say Iowa, where it's just topsoil for miles, it seems like, below the surface. But where do each play a principle? So with that started, kind of dive into it and going over to just some blends that we have in front of us. So we have four of our blends here that are a fall variety. And there's also some in the works that you guys will see in the future that we also are testing on, but we'll get into that at a different time. So kind of going down the row is, first we have Wicked Greens. So one of our main, kind of what you could say is the OGs of Rakk Fuel, is Wicked Greens. We call this the Bow Hunter blend. This is a blend that a lot of you guys are going to be using this year. When I think of early season, I'm thinking of October. Well, I want something so lucrative that the deer are going to come into that time frame, the does, the bucks, fawns, everything. So we have your oats, you have your peas, you have these really soft, palatable forages that the deer are going to just want to smash. On top of that, you have things like your winter wheat, your winter rye, stuff that's going to prolong. You have some brassica species in there that's going to actually get into that colder time period. And there's other strategies with when you get into these grain blends like Rack Magnet, Wicked Greens, where we looked at, I talked about soybeans. Can we take a soybean field? Can we broadcast? Can we go in with Wicked Greens or even Rack Magnet, go over to these areas and now amplify those soybeans that are browning up, let's say that mid-September, early September? Can we get it so the deer are now feeding a little bit longer? Also, cornfields. Believe it or not, you can overseed a cornfield. You can go in there and put in your turnip species. You can put in your grains, but we want to, once again, lengthen our food for the year. Going into it now a little deeper, we think, okay, we have our bow hunting blends. You go into now, all right, I'm a big rifle hunter or a big muzzleloader hunter. Well, I want those big, luscious bulbs. I want the purple top turnip, rutabaga. I want sugar beets. I want things that the deer are going to pound early on the greens, but we get them in the winter when the snow hits them. Like, I know Tom knows, like you go down to Iowa, you get that snow on top and you have turnips. It's incredible. Yeah, it's awesome. So that's going to be more of our last heartbeat, Rack Reaper. But your Wicked Greens, your Rack Meat, they also have that available into them as well. And then we also have, like I said, some goodies that are getting tested right now for the next year. So with that, I'll kind of open it up, kind of see what your guys' preferences are as far as, what is your go-to fall food plot blends?
One big thing for me is I'm really excited to get the Rakk Reaper in the ground. That's going to be a fun one for me. Got a couple spots that I actually have in soybean right now that I'm actually going to be taking out of soybean just to put in Rakk Reaper. So excited about that. But then I also go through and use the wicked greens, like you were saying, to kind of sweeten up those soybeans a little bit, put it in the ground. We plant our soybeans at 30-inch rows.
Okay.
So it works out really well for planting the wicked greens in there. So super excited about that. We leave all of our soybeans standing all year too. So it's going to be an awesome combination, I feel.
Absolutely. Yeah, and one thing I'll kind of on that too with the soybeans, like I have some compliant properties that are in northern Wisconsin where there is no food. Yeah, sure. So when you put soybeans in the ground, it's like putting my kids in the tub of ice cream. That thing's gonna be gone, So I put into my beans and I let my deer crush them. Just let them eat them. What it is so then I go back through, let's say, end of this month, or end of July, I should say, or early August, and I'll drill right through those beans. I don't care if I crush them or not. I want my next forage to come up. Let the deer eat on that stuff, but as the beans are getting eaten, you'll find as you winterize, your winter eat your oats, your peas, all that's going to come up as the beans are coming down, and now you never lost forage.
Sure.
And that's the name of the game. And if you lose forage and your neighbor still has luscious,
right,
you're in trouble.
They're not going to be on your farm. You touched on it already. We've got unbelievable drought conditions. Last year it was really bad. This year it's even worse. This is the worst 2-year stretch that I can remember. And what we dealt with a lot last year is guys that were planting beans that were calling up and they're like, hey, there's nothing left. They just didn't mature. They didn't get enough water to grow. What did grow, the deer ate them up. So they were asking what their options were. And a lot of them planted wicked greens and Rakk Reaper. Like Tim said, especially if you have 30-inch rows and you can go in, you can drill it, but you can go right in there and just broadcast right down those rows with the wicked greens in these drought conditions. But the same thing with Rakk Reaper. And at least then you've got something, especially during bow season. Everyone knows once those beans start to turn yellow, those deer, they're going to go find a different food source. And if you've got a spot where your stand is and you've been thinking all summer, I'm going to kill this giant buck that's been coming in here, and all of a sudden he just disappears. If you can plant this stuff and keep that green food source for them, that's a great way to keep that buck from summer all the way, to the rut, and give yourself the best opportunity at harvesting them.
100%.
And one thing to keep in mind with the wicked greens, if you are going back through your soybeans and doing that, 30-inch rows is great. You can do it, with the narrower rows. Try to, find some less weedy areas if possible. The other thing that I like to do, wait till the forecast says you're going to get a good rain. Yeah. So you're putting, especially if you're broadcasting it. Now, if you're going to go back in, because that's my plan is broadcasting. If you're going to go back in and drill them, it's not maybe as important to wait for, you obviously you want rain in the forecast, but if you can get the wicked greens planted before, 24 hours, 48 hours before a good storm's coming through, a good rain, it's going to help drive that seed into the ground and just help you that much more. So that's one thing that I look for before I go and plant, and we're usually doing that for me where I am, especially this year with a little bit of a drought. I'm probably going to be broadcasting this stuff probably the first part of August, really, is kind of the, end of July, first part of August for me, just because if I catch a rainstorm, kind of have to take advantage of it.
Right. Yeah. And one thing too to point out, if you are broadcasting too, is so obviously drought conditions, you get in clay country, the ground's rock solid. I mean, literally it feels like a stone. You might have to bump up your broadcast rate. So it's kind of the same thing with like when you're frost seeding. But when you're overseeding late season, if it's hard ground, you might have to go double the rate. I mean, you might have to just to make sure when the rain does come, it gets in the soil. So, yes, there's a rate on the jug saying, all right, use this much for this much acreage. But also keep that in mind. If you have rock solid ground, you're probably going to have to up that a little bit. Maybe double it up, maybe 1.5 times, just to make sure you get an actual germination.
Yeah, for sure.
And one thing too I'll point out with the soybeans, and I know Tom and I have talked about in the past, is don't just go out this willy-nilly and just do a farmer's field with it though.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is a quick way to lose a lease or make a farmer mad. Always ask permission on that kind of stuff, because there's things in here, like when you're talking your winter rye, your winter wheat, when you have grains, they do have a process called alleopathy. It's where they actually put the same process actually black walnuts have. Put an enzyme out in the soil and naturally suppresses growth. Well, the farmer's not going to be really happy if you're suppressing growth in future years or affecting yield. Or he comes in, let's say, to harvest soybeans, and he's collecting a bunch of this extra shaft and things like that into his combine. So always ask permission on that stuff. Make sure you have the go-ahead on it. But on the other end, if it's your field, there's all kinds of ways to do it, whether it be going through a standing field. I have some where I'll go and just disc up the soybeans and replant into it. But when you have these grains, you don't have to go that deep. Or even if you're at last heartbeat or rack reaper, you go into these soybean fields, let's say mid-July, third week of July, just broadcast. So this seed is so small, all it takes is that little crack in the soil, that'll drop in, it'll germinate. Now I will say, don't bulk up your turnip blends, because you don't want where it's like, you just...
They'll all compete each other.
Yeah, now you're dealing with little morsels the deer aren't going to feed on. And there too, if you're not truly making a seed bed and having good soil contact, just keep that in mind, that it might affect some growth, so you might have to adjust rate for that. But there too, when you go into and you look at all these blends, one thing that we pride ourselves on is we've made great single blends. But you could always go in there with Wicked Greens and Last Heartbeat. Maybe you want a little more turnip for muzzleloader, so you might want to spike them together too. And that's definitely a good strategy.
Yeah, I'll have to try that. I haven't tried that yet, but that'd be a good option for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what I like it too is, like, when you go into rack mate or Wicked Greens, I talked about that alleopathy. Not only are you helping yourself this fall, but next spring, when all this, the winter wheat, winter rye, even some residual oats, when they come back up in the spring, what you're going to have is, now you're going to have natural weed suppression. So you're not worrying about weeds in the springtime, or, we're trying to always cut down on herbicide use. And if you can plant that, now you let that stand come up. Well, what's happening in those winter rye, winter wheat oat fields? Fawns are getting born in it. Like this year, I had a unique situation with Hunter's Haven, where I had a hen turkey go into it, and she laid her whole clutch of eggs into it. I left it be. It looked stupid in my plot because there's this little triangle for her, but she laid there, she had her eggs, she hatched her poults. So now you have that benefit of the springtime and all that biomass, and you just started getting that really healthy cycle for your soil.
And you have that kind of that quick green up in the spring for turkey hunting too.
Absolutely.
Not just laying the eggs, but trying to kill that tom, in that green field. So it definitely works as that too.
And I've seen it like northern Wisconsin, and I'm sure it's a lot of the northern states, Michigan, Minnesota. But too, if you get that green up, if you have the food in spring, you are literally the one going to hold the deer for the rest of the year. If you don't have food in the spring, they're gone. Right. They're probably on, the old grandma's backyard bird feeder all winter. But if you have green up, they're looking for those greens. Right. You got them now. So it's kind of a 2-for-1 bang. Is you got all your fall forage, but then you also have spring forage as well. But now going into it, we talked about, obviously there's some strategy that goes into this. Deer are an edge animal, right? So I've seen it where I've planted, let's say Last Heartbeat and Rack Reaper. There's still a visible difference between the two when they're growing. That's an edge wherever you start that edge. Or if you have Wicked Greens next to Rack Reaper, or Rack Magnet next to Last Heartbeat, you can now make those deer follow certain lines. You can create new edges that the deer are going to use. So a lot of times I'll use that in my favor. So I have one big food plot I hunt with my son. So I want to obviously have the most activity as possible. So I'll put Wicked Greens next to Last Heartbeat. I'll have Hunter's Haven up on a knoll for bedding. I want as much forage as possible, but I'll create these edges with all these different fall blends, and I also have variety. So maybe your mature buck is a big fan of oats, but maybe the other big buck, he likes turnips. They're just like, once again, I'll refer to my kids. One of my kids is a great eater. He loves cheeseburgers. He loves chicken tenders. My daughter, it better be a cookie or it better be ice cream or she don't eat it. Deer are the same way to me. Treat them like children. Give them a variety. Let them see what they want to eat. So try to figure out on your property, okay, how can I plant Wicked Greens and Rack Magnet and Hunter's Haven, or how can I maybe wrap this all in and own a season lady luck clover lane to give that little bit of added protein around the edge of the plot. Start really get into like what I always call food plot architecture, where you're going to give them every little tiny morsel. All these blends have different kind of maturation dates in a way that, all right, that you're going to feed on this, and they're going to transition into this food plot. So you have a bowl, let's say this parcel right here is your bow hunting plot, and over here is where your gun stand is. Well, have the deer start here with, let's say, wicked greens, feed that up, eat that up, and transition into the last heartbeat in front of your gun stand, your muzzleloader stand. Try to visually kind of plan your season out. How do you want your deer to move? And you'll find is when they're going into those fall food plots, they'll show you how they're feeding it too. Is you'll go into like, okay, they come from the northeast corner, let's just say, you'll see the pressure there, and the pressure will slowly move from that circle until they get to actually their least kind of wanted area to be, whether it be safety reasons or forage reasons. But to me, that's half the fun is designing.
Right. Yeah. A lot of the customers that we helped kind of create some different designs and then the different test pots that we put out, even if it's a half acre or, as small as a quarter acre or even more, we're not doing just picking one blend and planting it. We're doing 2 or 3 different things and strategically putting, like you said, wicked greens closer to our bow stands and Rakk Reaper or Last Heartbeat closer to our gun stands and blinds. So it's just like when you go to a restaurant, especially like a buffet, you're looking at it, you're like, oh, I'd like to try a little bit of this or a little bit of that. Deer the same way. If you can give them a multiple options to go in there and not just for that day, but just trying to keep them from the beginning of bow season to the end of muzzleloader, we want those deer to keep coming back to those plots and give you the best opportunity for success.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you're going from, if you're only planting one thing in your plot, let's say you're thinking, oh, I'm just going to plant wicked greens. Well, that's 6 different varieties. Well, if you have a half acre and you do half of it in wicked greens, half of it in something else like a Rakk Reaper, well, you just went from 6 different varieties to 12 different varieties of plant. So it is definitely beneficial to spread it out a little bit. And
oh yeah. Well, like Tom said, it's truly making a buffet.
Yeah, absolutely.
And any client property like I start on in the year, I always want to go, all right, what do your deer like? Because you always hear like the old adage, like my deer don't eat brassica, but then they keep planting them year after year. Or, oh, my deer won't eat, plant A or plant B. So a lot of times when I go into a new food plot, let's say you put in your very first food plot, I want to figure out what my deer like. So I am making those kind of concoctions, your mad scientist buffets, and then I'm going back and going, what are they feeding on? Yeah. You might find out that you planted Hunter's Haven and they're smashing buckwheat. All right, now that's a key. Oh, wow, you look over and they haven't touched a sunflower. They haven't touched, maybe they haven't touched a sugar beet, whatever it might be. But you'll kind of find what your herd likes. So start with a lot of variety, and then over time, you can kind of narrow it down. One thing I will say, and something kind of comes from the gardening world, and so one thing like my dad and kind of passed on to me, but we were big in the gardening. And so you learn a lot about root diseases, and you learn about these different bugs. And one thing to point out is when you're dealing with brassica species, if you have poor soil health, you kind of open up the world to some of these different root diseases. So you can also get like the cabbage rootworm, where it goes in and it'll actually eat your roots away. So one thing I usually recommend too is if you're been a really big proponent of brassicas and maybe they're not doing as well, or turnips, rotate that out, because any kind of rotational, and this is why farmers do it a lot of times too, is the more rotation you get year after year. So like this year, maybe plant wicked greens, but next year plant Last Heartbeat, and keep switching it up, is you're going to actually put disease away. And that's all integrated pest management. So if you want to kind of keep that stuff at bay, it's the same thing with my garden. Like I'll take one year, I'll put my kohlrabi in one area, and the next year I'll put it somewhere else, and I'll replace that area maybe with, peas. And I want to constantly rotate. And that's, like I said, that's integrated pest management. That's been around for decades, centuries. Just keep disease at bay. Because if you get something into your plot that disease is hitting your plants, what's going to happen? It's no different when when we talk about having good nutrition, whether it be using feed, mineral, food plots, whatever it might be. But if a deer is shocked and it's not doing well, his antlers go down. Same thing with plants. If plants are stressed, what's going to happen? They're going to get woody, fibrous. They're not going to taste good at all. Well, now you might have a plot that looks good, but the deer aren't eating it. Sure. So there's definitely strategies too to sweeten plots. First and foremost, it's all about soil health. So we want to make sure, do you have actually the soil conditions that are good for growth? So do we have enough nitrogen? Do we have enough potassium, phosphorus? So we want to start thinking that too is our fertilizer game. Whether it be using a liquid fertilizer, a granular fertilizer, but we want to make sure the plants have everything they need to do well. And so for me, like for instance, I'm in Wisconsin, we're potassium deficient, big time, across the whole state. Phosphorus is hit or miss, typically low in nitrogen. And there's strategies for that. So nitrogen, you can get added nitrogen through the use of like Hunter's Haven is a great nitrogen builder. Any of our clover blends, Lady Luck, Own the Season, those are great for building nitrogen. Soybeans are always great. And you get those nitrogen credits where you don't have to fertilize with nitrogen per se, but your potassium, your phosphorus, those things you should be definitely adding every year. Like clovers, for instance, deer are not touching your clovers in the fall, and you're like, man, it looks great. I mow it. It looks gorgeous. But deer aren't using it. It tells me that they're probably bitter. The deer they're not getting the sugars out of them. So there you can use ammonium sulfate. That'll sweeten the forage, make it more palatable. And then even too in the fall, you should technically be winterizing your clovers with a 0060. So that's pure potassium. And that'll actually help strengthen the roots. So the next year you have a better growth as well. So always know too, you should be looking at getting soil samples done. I mean, not everyone does them. And you go online, you go on social media, and everyone's just like, I don't need a soil sample. It's been looking great for years until year 4 or 5. So you're like, and my plants are purple and yellow and all kinds of parts of the rainbow because they didn't take care of the soil.
So what about, using a fall food plot to kind of increase your spring food plot game? Like for instance, for me, it's a small, narrow 1 acre bean field. It's getting hammered right now because it's in beans. Our plan is we want to turn that into a clover field for, the spring and going forward. We want to have the Lady Luck in there. What we're going to do is we're going through and rototilling all the beans out because they're hammered. We want to get a fall food plot down, but is there any benefit to adding clover while you're seeding in your fall food plot to help get that clover established?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you do that? Does it outcompete your fall food plots, things like that? Like, where do you stand on that?
Oh, that's a great strategy because now anytime you can reduce how much you're working the ground, it's the better. Sure. So like I like going in with cover crop blends. So to me, cover crop blends are like your Wicked Greens and Rakk Maine. It's stuff that has the grains in it because once again, that allelopathy in there. But I'll go and I'll seed it directly with Own the Season, Lady Luck, Showtime. I'll put my perennial mixes in there. So then when spring green-up comes, they're already hitting the ground running. Because one thing you'll see with clovers, or you'll see like with chicory species or like the species that are in Showtime, first year they're slow going. They're all worried about roots. They want to get roots in the ground. So there's not this big luscious patch typically first year. Some instances there are, but put those in, let Wicked Greens, and even too your turnip species, your Last Heartbeat, your Rack Reaper, but you can put those in as a cover crop. You will focus on those so they're not smashing the clovers, the chicories, plantains, you name it. But no, I love doing that strategy, and I don't lessen. For instance, if I do, let's say an acre, or let's say in your instance, like that acre, I might go full rate Wicked Greens, but I'm also gonna go full rate on my perennial. Yeah, because it's not gonna impede on this at all.
Sure.
But you want to make sure you have.
That was my biggest fear is, how fast is that clover going to come up? Is it going to impede with what I'm trying to do and accomplish in the fall? Because it is it is a primary food source that we use during fall hunting.
Yeah.
So I didn't want anything to impede the growth of that. So we still have good hunting in the fall. Yep. We have the clover establishing and then probably come back through, do a little frost seeding in the spring.
Yep.
And go from there.
Yeah, and even there too, like Rakk Maine, for instance, that one has annual clovers in it. So now we're, and biannual clovers. So when we go in there, we have grains, we have the radish and all that in there. But as you plant that, you're gonna have that natural cover crop already. Next spring, you're going to get your Balanza, your Crimson Clover. Those are all going to come back, for their last year, essentially, their seed, your flowering year. And now you can terminate that, which just added that big nitrogen biomass I just talked about, going into another fall food plot year if you wanted to. Or there's Ladino clover in there, so that's a perennial. You can now thicken it up with your Lady Luck or go into Showtime, go into Own a Season. So that even opens up the door more so with Rakk Magnet to now manipulate. Am I just looking for a cover crop in spring? Am I looking for my clover, perennial plots? But that's why I love that one as a really good cover crop. Like a lot of times we talk at shows and through clients and all that about Rakk Magnet and Showtime. A lot of times we'll recommend those two together. Rakk Magnet being our cover crop, Showtime being our next year perennial. Because once again, with Showtime, it has chicory plantain in it. They have very, very deep tap roots. Well, it takes a lot of effort for that plant to get that tap root down. So protect them year one, because if deer come through, now you're just sitting there with a big brown mess. So doing those two together works, and we go back into the blending again. That's a great concept.
Right. So for Tim's, what he's trying to do, if he did the Rakk Magnet and the Lady Luck, his best bet would just frost seed that clover again.
Yep, 100%.
So then he doesn't have to go in and work that ground up.
100%. Yeah, because that's the thing that we're trying to make it easier, because we do a lot of food plotting. We have a lot of acres, and we don't, in my opinion, we don't have enough of those perennials, and which are very important, right? So if we can turn a 1 acre long, narrow food plot into a perennial, it's just better. And it is a lease. Landowner doesn't want us to spray, things like that. We're thinking clover, we can come back, cut it, manage it that way to help keep the weeds out of it too.
Well, and there too, the more rotation you have, like obviously, you have young kids, I have young kids. You know how it is with young kids. You might not have time. I need to try to find time away from baseball and all this kind of stuff. I'm sure you know how it is, and you know how it is. You don't got time. So the more you can plant a fall plot and have that dynamite hunting season, but then rotate into your spring blends, whether it be for cover crops or the leopathy we talked about, now you're freeing up more time. So that way you're not like, oh, all right, I got to get there. Not that none of us like doing food plotting, that's what we, at least tell the wives.
Right.
But with that said, the more time you can go and maybe have your food plots doing their thing, and you can go up in the woods, do some TSI, hinge cutting, or you can put that water tub, wildlife pond in. You want to, in a way, get stuff established so that way it opens up room to do more on your properties too.
And in my case, it's just another variety of food that we currently don't have. So going back to, small food plots and offering a lot of variety. Well, if you take a 30,000 foot view of your property, you kind of have to do the same thing. They have to have their spring green up. They have to have their fall plot. They have to have all this stuff. So if you look at it that way too, it's just, for me, it's going to be getting another variety in the ground.
100%. And the big thing, everyone wants to put these fall plots in because they're associating them with hunting. But the clover plots, they're as important as anything else with that high protein. The one thing that we definitely like to do, we like to run, even if it's like a 10-yard wide strip around the perimeter of your food plot. Those deer, they like to cruise those plots, the clover strips, and they're gonna, that's where they're gonna have their scrapes. And if you can hang those vines, you can get a lot of pictures. And if you put that mock scrape or that vine in that perfect spot by your tree stand, and get them to stop there, it gives them a chance to increase your odds of success. But also it gives them one more thing to eat, and just gives them more variety. But I like having that high protein for them.
Oh yeah, and then like you said, like the runway, it literally is just that. Like during a rut, you put a bunch of scrape vines or hemp ropes, whatever you might use, put your attractant on it, and those bucks are cruising that stuff. Then on the inside of that, like where your main food plot is, you put the wall so they can't see what's going on. Those deer will run that thing nonstop. You put some doorways that go through the wall so they can enter the food plots, the fall plots. You just made this dynamic area where a buck's gonna spend more time there than less. If you have, we all see it so often where a guy has that acre and he just plants it one thing wide open. he's usually not killing a big deer on that. But yeah, you do like the clover or Showtime too, high calcium. You put something like that around the lane. I mean, it's incredible.
One thing that I'd like to do this year, we have the way that my one of our big fields lays out is I'm actually going to be rototilling through some of my corn, kind of a runway through my corn into another, 1/4 acre plot, but I'm not making it a straight line. So when they stand in that runway, he can't see directly into that other plot. So I'm making it kind of like an S shape. Absolutely. So he's got to travel through that now to see what's in that plot. And by that time he'll be 30 yards and in the kill zone.
Right.
So, in theory.
Right. Absolutely. That's a perfect way to do it. Because like you're saying, if you have, one big plot and it's just a brassica or something that doesn't get very tall, they don't even have to come out of the woods. They can look and see if there's any does in there. If you have a wall or hunter's haven, something that obstructs their view, or like you said, if you're using that corn, they don't have a choice. They've got to come in, and if you can take and pinpoint where they're going, it just increases your chance. But you want to pull them out of the woods. You want to get them into that plot, and that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. It's kind of going back in high school. You look down the row of the lockers and you look for the good-looking girl. And if you saw, you're like, no, she ain't here. You left,
Right.
But if there's a bunch of people in the way, you're like, all right.
Yeah,
you're looking around.
exactly.
Right. But there's kind of switch gears here a little bit too. A lot of guys might be asking, I don't have big plots. Sure. That's another thing I think we hear a lot for fall food plots is, what's the best bang for my buck? Sure. So maybe a guy only has 1/8 acre, 1/4 acre at max. They're going, well, all right, I love the idea of food plot architecture. I love the variety, but maybe it's a kid putting in his first food plot. Like I think my nephew Dallas, he's 12 years old, and he just went and put his little tiny food plot for him to hunt. Right. Awesome. So what's our best bang for our buck? I guess open up to you guys. I guess in your opinions, what would you be choosing for that small plot?
For a small kill plot, I guess if it's me, the Rakk Magnet. That it's an 1/8 acre jug, so it's made for just a tiny little plot. And there's there's a number of different varieties of plants in there to give them something different. It stays green. That to me, if I'm picking one thing for a kill plot, I'm picking Rakk Magnet.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. It's just so versatile with what's in it and what you can do with it. Like you said, you can add other things to it if you want. You can do this, that, and the other. It's a very, very versatile blend. It helps build the soil a little bit. Let's say you want to put it in there. It's throwing some good nutrients down. So if you do want to come back in a year and do something different, you can, because you've just helped build the soil up too. So I would recommend Rakk Magnet as kind of your first timer.
And I would do Rakk Magnet with Showtime, like you
100%.
talked about before,
100%.
Because then you can go back in and frost seed that Showtime, and now you've got a full year-round blend. And the nice part with this, you don't have to have a lot of equipment. Some sweat equity, like you talked about earlier. You can go in there with a rake and clear everything up, as long as you get a little bit of seed to soil contact.
Yeah, it does not need to be deep.
And you don't have to have a lot of sunlight with those two blends. That's what we created them for, was to be shade tolerant. Showtime, that's a whole nother thing. I mean, that's realistically that blend it's really going to need its own podcast.
Yeah, it's an episode all by itself, just that blend.
There's not enough time, when you're talking about everything else, because of how many different things that blend can do and how unique it is. But if you're looking to plant something in the fall in a little kill zone in the woods, Showtime and Rakk Magnet together, that's as good as it gets.
Well, yeah, and then some of those plots, those little ones, can be the best plots.
For sure.
And we love going on a tractor for hours, radio headphones, maybe a nice cold beverage or two. But when you get in these little plots, that's a lot of times where these, the big bucks are getting killed. Yeah. So a lot of times you get these little plots, you're doing, because I would have said the same thing, Rakk Magnet, Showtime. That's my go-to interior food plot, small plot, first time plot. But now you put some scrape vines up there, you put a wildlife pond or water tub or an earth pond in there. You just make it like this little internal playground.
Yeah.
It's stupid good.
It acts as a staging area.
Yep.
You know, for those bigger bucks, they feel comfortable. They're in the woods. They can see around them. It's a good strategy. You know, you look at food plots. Everybody wants these big, gorgeous, perfectly manicured golf course looking food plots. Bigger's not always better. Bigger's good.
Yep.
But don't overlook your small spots. Don't overlook those spots that you go in with a leaf blower and clear out the leaves and a rake and rake up the dirt. Like, it might be 1/8 of an acre and you're thinking, it's just way too small. Don't think about it that way. Think about it as a kill plot.
And to me, it's kind of also one of those little plots, you know, especially when you're trying to bring kids in the outdoors.
Yeah.
To me, it's so cool to give them that, like, hey, this is your little area. They go in there with the leaf blower, the rake, you know, a little backpack sprayer, maybe they have to, you know, kill some weeds, whatever it might be. But you make it their own. Like, give them a camera, give them some vines, be like, it's yours.
Yeah.
And they learn from that.
Absolutely.
My very first plot, I was up there with a rake, and I remember my dad looking at me like, yeah, that looks dumb.
What are you doing that for?
I remember just going, and my brassicas got like this big. But now with that said too, one thing I will say, there is some stuff to avoid also with small plots.
Sure.
You don't want to be planting your Rakk Reaper and Last Heartbeat in these small plots. You know, you want to avoid that. You know, they don't do good in sun or without sun.
Sure.
You're going to see they're going to try to climb and get sun, but they're not going to do well. So if you're doing really small plots, try to avoid your turnip brassica species. You know, you want to get more of your grains, you know, more of your clovers, your chicories, your perennials, all that kind of stuff. Your turnip brassica species just don't do as well. Now, if you're like in open sun, that's one thing, but you also find is you'll have so much more forage with the rack magnet, the wicked greens, lady luck, Ona season, showtime, whatever it is. You'll have a lot more bang for your buck with those in a small plot because there's more plants per volume.
Yeah.
And they can also take pressure.
Yep.
You get Last Heartbeat or Rakk Reaper, and let's say it's an 1/8 acre. There's only so many turnips in that plot. You know?
Right.
And the deer eat it, and you're like, well, that was cool for a week.
Right.
You know? So one thing to think about, you know, but also diving back to the big plots, you know, we talk about little plots. I like to take like an acre and a half plot, and I'll divide that thing into, like, for instance, one year I had an 1.5 acre plot. I had 7 different food plots in that acre.
Yeah.
Using the wall, I blocked it all off. It looked like, honestly, like a pig pen, where it's like, all right, you know, the feral hogs are here, the sows are here, the piglets are here, but it was all subdivided with those doorways, and the deer interacted. I'd see a doe with her triplets in one. I'd have a 2-year-old buck in another. I'd have maybe a couple does in another one. They didn't even know each other there. Right. Now we think about the rut. We think about that mature buck, and we're like, damn, I gotta check every one of these. But how many more opportunities do you get? Right. Or we've heard the stories at shows where a guy's like, yeah, buck came by, drew back, missed. Well, if you have the architecture, he might work and come right back to you too. Yeah. Or if it's a big plot, wide open, and you missed, it's probably your only chance.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Absolutely.
And I think one of the biggest things that we do to try to make not just the hunters successful, but to give them, like you're talking about, their best bang for their buck. Our food plots are never going to be the cheapest. There's no way around that because we're buying the best ingredients, the best seed. You know, we work our rates, you know, by broadcast rate. And not everybody does that. You know, a lot of them are given that drilled rate, so it seems like you're getting a better value. The whole purpose of doing this, when you're going and spending all this time and money to put these food plots in, you want to get as much tonnage, you want to get a big, full, lush plot, you know. So we've got these rates, I mean, right down to a T, to where it's, that whole plot is going to be full. We're going to bring as much greens. We want to keep those deer coming in. The worst thing that could possibly happen is if they eat everything up before you get a chance to go out and hunt. You know, and if on some of those ones where their package, you know, it's not as much. If you have to buy 2 of them to do what they're saying that the rate covers, what kind of value do you really have? You know, that's the biggest thing for us.
Yeah, for me, like using, you know, some of our competition in the past before I got involved with Rakk Fuel, it really irritates you when you get to a 1/2 acre field and you're broadcasting and you get about half of it, and now you got to go back to the store and buy another jug like that. And that's what one thing, that we're trying to avoid with our rates is it's a true broadcast rate, because probably 90% of your food plotters out there are broadcasters. Not everybody's running through a grain drill. Right. I broadcast. Yep. So it's definitely important to me. I know that.
Well, and that's the thing, even like when you have the drill or compared to broadcasting too, like even if I have availability to a drill, like when I get to my turnip species, I'm still broadcasting. Yeah. There's a peace of mind when I have my chest spreader on and I'm seeing what I'm covering, and I can watch my rate. There's a drill, so you open up the bin and you go, uh-oh.
Yeah.
2 rows of...
This tube's full, this one's empty.
Correct.
Not great.
But yeah, I mean, and Tom's exactly right. When you look at, we put as much seed bang for your buck in these jugs as possible. There's some competitors out there where when you really look at the label and you start really understanding a label, you go like, I have to buy 2 bags to actually get this rate.
Yeah.
On the bag, it might be like, oh, it covers half acre, but in reality, it covers a third, a quarter. Right. So now you're losing value. And I used to be dumb to the concept. I plant and I didn't know weeds and stuff back then. So I thought, well, it's be part of the blend.
Yeah.
But really, it was water hemp, velvet leaf.
The stuff you don't want. Yeah, absolutely. I fell victim to the same thing. So.
And in there too, what you guys might find, we talked about like, what if some of these fail, let's say this year. Let's say July, you start planting and we have a drought still, and we don't get the rain. And it fails. You have time. Your turnip blend, stuff that way. Let's say if you're in the north, we're looking at that late July. That's kind of money. But turnip blends, you kind of have to like mid-August. And I've seen some luck because most of these maturation is about 45 days. So when you really start thinking that concept, that's to get a full yield vegetables. Like when you think of the garden world, you look at a package of let's say tomato seeds or whatever it might be, and you go like, okay, 65 days of maturation. That's to get the full fruit to yield. Before that, you still have forage. Right. You're still greens. The deer doesn't care like, oh, it's not perfect yet. Darn.
On to the next one.
Once again, animals are smarter than us. Us humans, we just wait. Like, okay, it's not perfect.
Yeah. They browse on it still.
Correct. But with that said, like let's say you did put that last heartbeat Rakk Reaper out. You didn't get the rain, didn't germ. Now you can start looking like, okay, we can switch up. We can now do a Wicked Greens, a Rack Magnet into September. And still have yield. Grains will grow well. I've known guys late September still putting these down. You might not get the big forage collard or rape or kale or whatever it might be, but you're gonna still get those grains that the deer are gonna pound.
Right, and that's going to be important, especially this year with the conditions that we have. We just can't get any rain. It's the whole Midwest. And we're selling stuff. Pretty much all over the country, but most of what we're selling is the Midwest right now, because the shows that we go to, the exposure that we've had, most of it's been in the Midwest. Yeah. But so like Zach said, if you're having those same conditions and it's drought and you're starting to really get nervous and trying to figure out how you can get your best chance to get something growing, and it starts to hit closer to September. If you can get Wicked Greens and Rack Magnet in the ground, you're still going to have a good chance to get a good growth and pull deer in.
Yeah, and definitely have a very viable option as far as a kill plot.
Yeah, and in those 2 blends too, they have most of the species in them are about 30 to 45 day maturation. So they're very short growing or fast growing, short season plants. So you don't really have to worry. It's like you get some of these. Like some of our competitors use some different turnip species that have 120 day maturation days. That's crazy. It's 4 months.
Mm-hmm.
Who has that time to like hope and pray?
Right.
I've tested some long day turnip blends that were 120 or plus, and you're sitting and you're just like, oh, please. Right. But I will say, don't wait either. Like if you see that it's not up to par, work that thing and replant. There's no harm in that, but if you wait too long and you're like, oh, maybe it'll come back, there's a point that you got to jump. Yeah. If you get into that August, you might want to jump and just say, I'm redoing it. When you're talking 30, 40, $50 that saves your season, to me, it's worth it.
Right. 100%. And one thing for me, like not necessarily with the Wicked Greens, but my Rakk Reaper. In a year like this where we're not getting a lot of moisture, I'm actually getting my seed in the ground, like those blends, earlier than I normally would, just in the hopes of catching a rain. Because, you know, usually I'd wait till the end of July to put those in. Well, now I'm kind of on the front half of July going, I might want to get some of the seed in the ground in case it actually rains.
Yeah.
And now it's starting to germ by that, that end of July to be in good shape. That's one thing I'm doing this year to hopefully, help with my success, just because of the weather. If it was a consistent year, I'd have no problem putting them in normal. But this year for me, it's going to be a little bit earlier.
Yeah, and there too, to kind of, in a way, turbocharge the growth too. You can look at liquid fertilizers too, where now give them the water, give them the nutrients to kind of expedite that growth too. So look into those variables too, like turnip species, they love urea. They want nitrogen. Wait for a good rain, pound them with some nitrogen. You'll find that growth will spike. Yeah. And you can get that added growth. You might not get the big vegetable, might not get the big turnip, but if you get the big leaf matter, that's helpful. You're ahead of the game.
Yeah, and be careful with the urea. Like you said, wait for that rain.
Absolutely.
If you put it on and you don't, it could end up, you will be probably planting something else later in the year. But be careful with that. But for sure, they need nutrients just like everything else.
So I guess kind of wrap up this little bit fall food plot segment. When we go into this, obviously, and you're starting to plan this out, there's a couple things we want to obviously summarize here. Is look to get variety. Try to strategize how you're planting, what you're planting it for, whether it's bow hunting, gun hunting. Use the wall to screen off your plots. Doing these clover run lanes. Know your soil conditions. Know if you need to fertilize and things of that nature. And once again, like we talked a little while, is plan for spring too. Plan how you can improve for the spring. But now's the time to really get that strategy in place, or be crazy like me, where I sit in my gun stand planning the next year already, drawing up stuff. I mean, that's why I don't put my wife in my stand. She'd think I'm nuts, because just paper after paper of me drawing different designs and then X through that one. No, but no, have fun with it. Get out there, do those small and transitional food plots with your rack magnet, your showtime. Get out and do some wicked greens into your soybeans this fall, even cornfields if you planted them. But in a day, you guys have questions on which one's right for your area. Shoot an email over, and be really happy to help.
Yeah,
to
100%.
help plan.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's been great.
So I guess kind of leave everyone with something. If you had to pick all of our blends, what is your go-to fall blend?
Wicked Greens.
Wicked Greens, I think it's just kind of like the rack magnet. It's just extremely versatile. You can plant it by itself. You can put it in things. You can blend stuff with it. Wicked Greens for me.
I want to be different, but I also say I love Wicked Greens. So, but that's it. So take a look at it. We'll be at the shows, stuff like that, where you can pick up seed. But yeah, like I said, shoot an email, give us a call. We'll help you determine seed rate, what one works great for you, fertilizer, all that kind of stuff. So, but good luck planting this fall.